The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. Still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, the group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Aloha everyone, I'm geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont of HawaiiTracker.com, bringing you guys another Hawaiian Volcanoes update. Today, Thursday, January 27th, 2022. We'll be taking some questions to discuss along the way today. Going to give you guys an update on Kīlauea, touch base on Maunaloa a little bit, not a whole lot going on there. And then we're going to turn to two USGS Volcano Awareness Month talks that were given as part of video updates the last 2 weeks here. So one on deformation and one on gas, and we'll discuss that with you guys as well. So drop your questions in the chat. Let them know if you have any issues with our audio or with our video, and we will try to include you guys as much as we can here. So to start things off, what's going on with Kīlauea right now is the volcano is still erupting. This is a screen capture I caught from one of the web cameras of the reactivation following the most recent pause of that west vent there. See the west vent is area zone right up here, and lava is bursting out and coming all around and across. A little preview of a time lapse that we'll show you guys a little bit later. So that's kind of what was happening over the past week. Right now, we'll reload this USGS-HVO S1 camera looking from the south rim to the northwest, and this is a fairly recent view within the last 10 minutes here of the lava lake. That west vent cone is right over here. And there's that west pond that seems to be sometimes more crusted over, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. And it's got this little channel that's going through this narrow entry point into this cooling zone over here, right? This is the open lava lake surface with this lighter colored gray over here. And everything on the outside is hardened crust. There's lava underneath that, but much thicker down, much farther down. Can't really see as much over here, but the lava is moving underneath this entire area and popping up on the far side of the crater, as we'll see in some of the other images here. So, different perspective. This is the F1 camera, thermal camera from the USGS, looking down. That west vent cone is right over here. The pond is right over here. An entry point going into the pit right there. And here you can see in the backside the flows that are filling that down drop block area, still active and going. And that's one of our clues that there's still some connection of the lava coming up underneath this crust. Perhaps putting vent out of its chimney over here, right, and lava spatter whenever it can. Putting out a lot of lava out this way. Seems to go back under the crust somewhere in there, in that area. And some of it, whichever way it gets there, is making it all the way across underneath all of that to pop up on the far side of the crater over there. Still well connected. Still a reminder is lava underneath this entire purple cooled area of crust here. And we'll see evidence of that here as we rewind in time. First, let's look back this last week as we rewind from the S1 camera. The time lapse put together by Dane, Mahalo Dane, compiled with images from Dane and Bob Martin as well. And here you can see that at the beginning of last week we had a short pause. It was a half a day long. Lava burst back forth, and then we have this longer 3-day pause that occurred for most of the week. So really, of the last week, half of it was spent in pause, and then you can see it burst back forward and refilled that same area as it had before. That's the long-term pattern. Hasn't changed a whole lot from recent weeks. That's what we've seen really since December, is this pattern of pausing, stopping and starting, stopping and starting. Sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. On average, a day. You know, we had a half a day, we had a 3-day one. We had something a little unusual in the most recent one we'll talk about, but overall that's been the range of it. So if we go back to look at the last week here in the F1 thermal camera, there's that first short pause. It barely registers before that next burst comes through. And then it pauses again. You see that prior to that we had oozing up on this crater wall on the west side, and so lava is still coming underneath there. And then that first burst out here, I'm going to pull it back and rewind it, just so we can see a little better there. Burst out of the west vent cone, and then burst out from this west pond area as well, before we see lava later resume here on this far side. So that's been the past week. Rewind it a little bit here. There's kind of the peak extent, lava flowing out from this area. Really see it going off in every direction. Slightly earlier than that, it was more coming out from the cone area itself, right around here. So to show you guys that, we'll turn to the other camera, but first give it perspective. Let me rewind and show you guys this entire eruption. All in 2.5 seconds here. So this is essentially 4 months. We'll mark 4 months and 2 days here. It'll be the 29th of September that this started, so it's 27th of January, 2 days away. And I like to, once in a while, throw this in there just so you can see the overall patterns. And maybe the most obvious one to note is the extent of the lava lake was obviously covering the entire pit at first, retreated fairly quickly to this western area, but even in the western area you can see it's gone from more of a round shape to having more of these fingers and bays and areas like here and here, and it's almost like wings off of that smaller round pit. So even now it's still contracting a little bit slowly. It's something that's not as easy to see unless you really focus in on areas like I can stop moving here. Areas like the edge like this that keep creeping in. Lifting up and creeping in. That's the other thing to note here is do see the crust being lifted continually still, and that's the main pattern here. You can see the lava at this speed. It looks like it's almost constantly circling the rim of the crater here, all the way around, oozing up underneath the edges of this big, darker plate. That's the main thicker crust. Right, that's one part of it. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, if I can zoom in here, is it might be hard to tell, but there's almost like some pulsing. These ledges are not rising uniformly up, but they seem to rise quicker than less, and up and down. And it's almost like it has like a pulsation motion, and of course it has something to do with the speed that I set it to here. But that's just a pattern to note, that there is variable deformation, where some parts of the crust are maybe getting pushed up and down more if they're near this western area. The other areas maybe are getting pushed up more uniformly. We'll leave it at that. We can come back to that and discuss it in the future. But let's turn to the current view now of the V1 camera. This is looking down in a really zoomed in area. That west vent cone is over here. And down here on the left, bottom left, is what I've been calling that west pond. Lava channel coming out, flows out into that main crater in that direction like that. And sometimes you can see this area is larger, sometimes it's smaller. It's crusting over from time to time, and that crust breaks apart and gets rafted across, and there's lava underneath the entire thing. And perhaps more instructive is to try to note the level of the lava relative to the edge here, right? So sometimes you can see this is a deep pit, and the lava is not up by the top of it right now. Right now, it just looks like a almost even pond with the surroundings, right? But if we come back to the V1 animation here, and first we'll play this little clip that I pulled out from the middle of it. So there was a moment during the 6 a.m. Burst of lava that came out of the west vent here, where the USGS zoomed their camera out a little bit, and for just a few frames of the webcam, we actually see it zoomed out before it comes back in here too. So a couple of things to point out there. There is that pit once again on the left. Right, the level of lava is lower in it. I'm going to just while I'm pause here. Lower in it, and you can actually see through this crack on the wall, the lava is pouring out and filling the lake from that direction, from the direction of that west vent cone, as we discussed as a curiosity last week. And we also imagine it's coming from below. It's really coming from below up that way, and then across that way. But it's also coming down this way and up as well. It's really coming in that blade from all directions that way. So, right, I'm gonna play this, and we'll see. And it's a little psychedelic, yeah. But I think we can hang through to see some of these details.
Yeah, I'm hoping we don't need a seizure warning on these.
So the thing that I thought was really interesting, besides the fact the lava is bursting out and fairly quickly coming through this main part of the vent right here, you can see the pit filling up and spilling over. I can zoom into that. Let me zoom in here so we can zoom into this pit area. It filling up and spilling over, and as it comes to the top, you see that crack that is feeding lava into it. The lava actually squeezes from that lake up that crack and starts oozing out the sides of there as well. I found that to be fascinating. We do have quite a bit of wiggle with this camera usually because it zooms so far in, so it's often moving around quite a bit. But you can tell when one part is moving relative to the other a little bit differently. So I'm going to zoom into this area right in here and put the cone just on the right side. And if you notice, that crack goes right through here. There's kind of a fissure that goes all the way up the side of the cone right through here. Right? And if you note closely, you'll see that this entire ledge right here is all dropping downwards, sagging downwards, to the point where the lava lake then laps up and over it as it drops down into the lake, essentially, right? So almost like it was bulged up before lava came out, because lava wasn't coming out, it was pushing everything upwards, the crust was formed upwards. And then as it burst out and relieved that pressure, the actual crust is sagging, and the lava that's on top of it now is starting to override that crust a little bit on the edges here. So that's all something we've seen in little details before, but what's fascinating now is essentially that the crust is breaking into smaller sections, right? So we have a section of this crust now that's essentially cutting across the vent here and attached and goes off the camera in this direction and back that way over here. And that whole thing is detached from the rest of the crust over here, and it's detached from the rest of the crust further over. And if I zoom it over to this pond area again, nope, like that. So maybe I won't zoom into that. But what I was going to point out is, so here, I was going to point out is that that crack area on this side over here as well when it comes across, you see this whole lake overflowing now in a direction to the left as well, as that whole plate bows down. And that's in part what seems to cause this pond to spill over to the south, right? It's not only that it's filling up to the edges and spilling over, but it's that all the rock around it is also sinking back down and deforming in weird ways. And so when that happens, it can actually push it over and tilt it over, and the whole thing can dump out and cause a big flood in one direction. That's what we're seeing there, I believe. So, not here. That's the area right in here. Right in there. See that lava start to go into that area of that little crack right there as well. Right at the end. So, okay, I won't fight that any longer. Let's show you guys a V1, the whole sequence for the last week, starting with that dropping of the lava in that pond, refilling. You see the crusting over pattern, spillovers. This is still before that big pause. Here comes the big pause. And you see there's still activity within that deeper pit. There's a 3-day pause, so it takes a while for it to come back here. But it does burst forth. It comes pretty quickly. And there it went, essentially. Now it's back to recently this pattern of the lava going through this channel and coming. So I wanted to point all of this out because our most recent frames here, we now see that this whole ledge has re-emerged and it's bobbed back upwards. So it's up higher again. It seems almost like the lava level inside of this pit might have dropped downwards, but it's just down relative to the edge of this pit and edge of this little cliff, and the cliff is moving around up and down as well. So it's getting really hard to tell just by relative measurements, one thing next to the other, especially in this zoomed in view, what is actually moving in there. And so that's why we turn to our lava depth, the laser rangefinder that USGS is putting online here. And that's this top image right here for the last week. If we look and zoom in on this last day or so, and really you can see that the lava has been rising. This was the surge forward after our pause, and then that initial decline that we typically see commonly after the resumption. So the lava depth is on top. It's following for the most part the pattern of summit tilt. It was doing that very, very well last week. But there's one clear mismatch going on here, which is unusual, and this is one of our highlights this week here. This tilt signal that inflation came up and then deflated again. Apparently this inflation didn't quite meet the threshold to end the pause and burst lava back forth out of that crust below. So the lava depth on top ends up with a 3-day pause, even though we actually had, it was like a 1.5-day deflation inflation, and then a shorter 1-day deflation inflation that followed afterwards. And those got lumped together as one long pause. Okay? So that's the first time that this has happened in this eruption, that we've had that pressure variation didn't quite meet it, right? And so maybe if I zoom in a little bit, you might say, okay, well, I had to get to this far up, but it was really not that far away in relative terms, right? If you take this as some proxy of measure of the pressure required to push the ground to tilt that much, and then also eventually to burst its way up. Right? It was almost there, but didn't quite make it. Went through another cycle and then back up again. Otherwise, it seems to be following that pattern once again, right? With the rising of the lava level corresponding to the small inflation going on as well. Back to that. Looking at the last month, that aberration was right in here. There and there is a missing spot, but otherwise the rest of the last 2 weeks is pretty close on. And prior to that, we might have discussed, if you caught our previous updates, that this during this era, the laser rangefinder was pointing towards the bank of the lava lake. So it was catching the overflows and the surges, but it wasn't catching a full swing of variations until that bank either collapsed or deformed and moved out of the way. So now we're pointing to a spot that's actually showing that full range of change, right? And so that was from 299, we'll call it, to 314, another 15 meters right there. So over 40 feet, 45 feet we had last time. 50 So quite a swing right in there within that canyon area. But interesting to note that despite all of that, even as it looks like the lava is actually perhaps closing into a smaller channel, it's not doing it because the level is dropping. The level is in fact rising at present. Okay. As far as gas, we've had a few gas measurements in the last weeks here. So one during the pause was very, very low. I want to say it was down around 50 something. Shockingly low. And the most recent one is up here, not quite 3,000, but in the range of 3,000 tons per day. So, and these are following the tilt pattern as well. So during the pauses, well, I mean, maybe this plot's better. During the low lava levels, the pauses, that's when the low gas value is coming in, and then during the high eras is when the high value is coming in. So the gas is following the pauses and refilling and following the tilt as well. And that's what takes us to our hazard update. The hazard is still the VOG going on, and we have it set here to the lowest threshold, so really there's nothing hazardous coming out. And this model is assuming that the VOG is coming out constantly as well. So this is worst case scenario. It depends when it actually puffs. If it happens to be a pause, then it'll essentially nullify any new output coming out. You can see it's based a lot on the island wind patterns here, and they're blowing for the most part from east to west, southwest here, as it often do. Although you can see that earlier today there was some of that slack winds that allowed this VOG to migrate towards the North Hilo area and into the saddle between Mauna Kea and Maunaloa here. So nothing to be alarmed about, but it's still in the air, and it's maybe more intermittent than it was, but still occurring. All right, that's our main hazard. That there's no sign of magma moving anywhere else, according to the USGS. So really, this is a fairly minor inconvenience, considering we can actually see quite a lot without any hazard, right? And so as far as what can you see, these are images from the USGS, but they're representative of what you can see from the overlook in the national park at Kēnakakoʻi, which is still the best place to see the majority of the action, depending on which areas of the crater have ooze-ups. If there's an ooze-up that happens on the southeast side, for example, it's pretty infrequent, but if that were the case, you could see it from the north side, somewhere in the Uekahuna area. You might see other things from other parts of the caldera. For those of you who are explorers, you can go and explore and see. You might find some other views from other areas around the caldera that are worth noting, that we'll share in the future here. But for now, if you're from the overlook, zooming into that lava lake, what you might see, if you're there in the daytime, is a lot of the silver crust. You might see these cracks with orange glow coming between those slabs of crust on the surface. And then you also see these bursts of gas and lava that spatter through that crust in many areas. You can see there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, there's 5, there's 6, another one over here, 7, right, just in this one image. And as this whole crust gets carried and moved from west to east, and eventually it gets recycled somewhere in these cave areas along the margin over here, it's not quite clear exactly what mechanism is going on there, but they're getting recycled back underneath that crust, and on the way, these spatter bursts get carried along. Essentially, they get recycled as well. So if you're there for long enough, you can see these spattering bursts, and they actually move slowly across the surface of the lava lake. Also visible is that west vent cone. Depending when you actually are there, you might see spatter coming out from the top or from some of these side vents there or there. But more likely, you see this west pond area putting the lava out that pours into the main surface of the lake there. One more view here of that cascade of lava coming from this west pond vent area. All right, the next series of photographs is from yesterday. Were published yesterday, but from the day before. Gives us some additional insight and also some measurements, right? So I'll read some of these captions for these ones here. So this one is a telephoto view of the western vent, captured on January 25th. That was this past Tuesday, 2 days ago. The summit eruption had been paused for several days, but had resumed several hours before the photo was taken. Over the course of those hours, lava breakouts from the south side of the west vent spatter cone built a small lava shield on the left. That's this area over here. So essentially lava started coming out of this area. You can see a little bit coming out over here as well, and build up this mound right to the side of the main vent, which is over here. We're looking from the south now, right? So when we showed you guys the opening photograph, all those flows are coming down this backside and flowing that way like that. This is just part of that crack that we showed you came across the one side and goes across all the way to over here as well. You can see it's leaking on this side as well. There and there. Building it up. So laser rangefinder measurements indicated the top of the main spatter cone right over here was standing approximately 21 meters or 69 feet above the surrounding lava flows of it. So question may make in at some point. How tall is that west vent at current time? 70 feet-ish, 21 meters, right? With the caveat that we just saw all the land is buckling and moving every day with pressure changes up. All right, so looking at the area where there's a perched edge of the lava pond, right? We talked about how some of the lava is actually getting recycled back under, but there is also occasional breaches of this perched levee, and those breaches send lava across this older crusted crater area with lava underneath it as well. But now you have surface flows on top of that crust, and they're spilling and flowing across there and there as well. And this one was measured by laser rangefinder as well. This one on the left was measured at 5 meters, 16 feet tall. See, there's probably a similar size one over here, like that, before it actually sends this flow around. So some dimensions of that thing, right? The rim is what this is telling us. The height of this rim above the surroundings here, about 16 feet tall. And another image here taken from the helicopter showing this larger landscape, right? Maunaloa in the background, the larger volcano north of Kīlauea, the summit caldera all through here. That inner pit of Halema'uma'u, that's where the lava lake is still contained, and all that within that larger downdrop block, another cliff right in here, there and there. And this image also shows down here at the very bottom in this teardrop shaped the public viewing overlook in Hawaii Volcanoes National. So perhaps on that one I will open that one further. Go to the original, all the way through, because then it gives me the highest resolution. I can zoom all the way in even more. Show you guys there. That's looks like lava from a 1971 fissure perhaps. Right, and then over here, this light colored area, this is the public overlook. Big cliff right here. So the view is off in this direction. If I zoom it all the way back out, you're going that way. So you can see the main west vent and the lava. Your public overlook and this is a pretty good review of what you can see nowadays. One last image was posted as well, and this is showing a geologist visiting from Cascades Volcano Observatory installing an upgraded web camera on the east rim of Halema'uma'u. This is that former B1 camera that's been out for a while. We'll turn to that camera view now. So let's take the camera view now. Okay, here is that new B1 camera. And the view is a little bit different from before. We don't have all those pile of rocks here in the foreground as much, right? We actually have a wider view. Reload this as well. A wider view that's showing lava flows on this downdrop block area over here on the right side. Get it back. There it is. The lava pond is still in a far background over here. Show you better views when we zoom it in here shortly. But there's a downdrop block with those flows, and so there might have been not quite clear exactly where it was relative to this view before, but we're seeing a little bit more essentially on this side over here. So farther up is that's the view from the B1. And if we look we'll look back here at the last 2 days of activity from the B1 camera, as compiled by Dane. Here in the background is that main lava lake. At nighttime, we see other spots of glow, which we'll focus on now. There's one spot over here on the left that we've had pointed out by Marin before, I believe. It's a spot that fumes in the daytime, glows at night. Oh, there's one over there and one over here as well. Both areas. That's consistent with those ooze-up flows. If I pan it over to the right side, then we can look at this down drop block area as well. And there's lava flows that we see as the main area advancing on the down drop block going this way. But also noteworthy, right in here, we can see there's actually a new little spatter cone coming up. So it's not clear exactly what we should call this. We'll wait for the USGS to make it official. But you know, some possibilities. If you consider that the old edge of the crater is probably underneath here somewhere, right? And it's going from something deeper to something shallower, like lava's coming up and going through, then it might be some kind of tube-like system that goes through there. And if you have a lava tube with a small opening and gas is shooting out and making a small little cone, you might call that a hornito. And that's a term we've seen before in flow fields. So it's not quite clear this is actually a lava tube, so I'm not sure that is going to be what they settle on. It might be something like a satellitic spatter cone because it's not over the main vent back over to the west there. But it is similar in essence where it is coming from deeper to shallower there.
It does look like that little hornito that appeared in Fissure 8 at the very end of the eruption in September 2018. You remember that little one?
Yeah, it does look like that one, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it spatters a little bit here. You can see it's kind of, it looks like it's actually building a little bit of a spire, right? It's kind of hard to see at this scale. It's kind of blurry, the resolution and all that. But you do see it is spattering and trickling up here, and it's been active, you can see, since this B1 camera was put in place. So as this will be our curiosity this week, and we'll explore this a little further. And we can do that by looking at this F1 for the last week here as well. And I'm going to zoom into this back area, back over here, and show you guys that there was a big ooze-up flow along that back wall that actually activated a couple of bright spots here in the foreground. And now we're going through the pause. The video is actually still playing. And then just recently you saw here the breakout on the drop block and a quick little flare up of that red spot right in there. So maybe I should play it again. A little more clear what we're looking at. We're looking in the area right in here. So you can see the ooze up comes up, and you can see it starts spattering right in those first few days earlier in the week. Then it shuts off. Then the new surge comes back forward, reactivates again here, and then a little bit over here. It looks like there's a very, very small flow. It's only a couple pixels in this zoomed in view before it actually comes back in through. So almost as if the lava that's coming out surged out underneath the crust, made its way underneath the crust here. The gas was able to vent out of this area first. Perhaps it went all the way, maybe it goes all the way to here and then curves this way, because it seems like it went from here in that order. But who knows what the pathway's like underneath there. It could be multiple branching pathways, and just a matter of which network it takes to eventually get gets there. But that's the origin of the thing earlier in this week. I'm here. Spot right in there. So this is also visible on a visible KW camera. So I'll play it here. It's of course easier to see at nighttime, but we'll rewind it to the last week as well. And you'll see that ooze up flow in the back. There it is. And you see perhaps a little spattering spot right over here. It goes on for a little while. That's off. Everything is shut off for a few days. The lava comes back. You can see it over here in the bottom right. And now we see reactivation. And then we see the flows coming in here. That seems to be the pattern, and it seems to be all be connected. It's pretty interesting, small little detail, and of course it's worth mentioning. None of this is changing the lack of threat to people, right? It's still perfectly safe, and just little details to dive into the science of here. So, all right, We'll take a break for questions at some point, but I see a few that are related to what we're talking about here with the cone and event. Maybe we'll take a couple of those right now, right? So one question we see here from the Greater Good. Is the spatter cone still growing overall height? It seems it's the same size over time while the lava lake continues its slow rise. It changes a lot. It changes a lot. It seems like when it's spattering just a little bit, the cone gets taller and taller and taller, and then when it bursts forward, it seems like it cracks the whole top off, and the whole thing falls apart and has to restart. So there's a lot of variation up and down at the top of it. But it's changing a lot, essentially. You know, when eruption began, the first few weeks, the cone was actually riding up with the crust, buoyed upwards. And then for the next month, it kind of got stuck and the lava started to drown it. And then it started to burst from the top again and build it up higher. So it's very, very dynamic and changing a lot. And so I think the estimate of 70 feet is pretty close to what we had a long time ago, ultimately. So it's probably varying around that number. That's what I would guess. Do you see any other ones, Dane, you want to point out here to help me out? Let's see, here's one here. When a flow stops and the surface drops, where does lava go so quickly? Right. The lava is still filling mostly the reservoirs underground. And it's the pressure in those reservoirs that connects to the surface that allows it to push the lava to the surface. And there's never been any definitive answer to what causes those deflation-inflation cycles, those pressure variations on a volcano, but it's thought to be related to the gases. You know, imagine you have a big bubble of gas that accumulates, then it wants to move its way through and out. Maybe not a big bubble of gas, but you know, like a gas-rich lava area, right? So lots of bubbles within the lava trying to come up and out. But you also have some of the lava that's lost most of its bubbles already, and it's trying to come back down that pathway. So you might have areas where you have a log jam, and the lava needs to drain. The denser gas poor lava is trying to get out of the way so the other stuff can come up and through, but it has to stop the path up to come down, and then it can resume and come back out again. That's, you know, one model that's been put forth as far as why that change actually happens. So the lava is still down there. It's essentially just rearranging itself to put the heavy stuff down and the light stuff up. And while it's doing that, you know, while it's backwards for that moment, everything has to pause until it can sort itself out, essentially. It's one way to look at it.
There is another question that kind of goes along with that from Richard, who asks, is there, underneath that cap inside the lava lake, is there like a Swiss cheese type structure for channels where it feeds magma to the vent and then to these areas where it seeps out, or is it more like a jelly donut, as we've talked about before? What is kind of the conceptualization of that?
Yeah, you know, really, I have no idea. You know, we have to ask some dynamicists more about that, right? You know, I mean, I suppose those are the end member cases there, right? You know, you imagine if you have enough cooling going on, then maybe you can start having concentrated areas of more flow and areas that don't move as much. They start hardening and cooling and becoming more solid, right? And then you could certainly imagine a Swiss cheese or a honeycomb structure or something we've described before underneath there, right? And then the other argument would be that, well, if you're putting all this hot material into there, then you maybe are keeping it, and the heat's having to disperse through that whole area and come out. It might essentially keep those areas from hardening and solidifying and the whole thing open as a jelly donut, as you say, Dane.
Right.
Because, you know, there might be stuff like imagine if there's anything that's denser, that's sunk to the bottom during a whole eruption, that's at the bottom of the crater, right? So like there actually might be some stuff at the bottom, and then you might have your layer, and then, but who knows? You know, I mean, that's all conjecture at this point. We can't really see in there, but it's cool to look at the evidence of the lava popping up through that satellite spatter cone and then out to the down drop block area sequence. Does seem implied.
Yeah, it makes sense. There is a couple questions about that tilt anomaly that we just saw, and you kind of went over a little bit. If you want to dive into those,
sure.
First one comes from CK, who's asking about that tilt mismatch and that other peak. Was that similar to anything that happened just before this eruption started?
No, not exactly. Not exactly. There were some tilt signals before the eruption. I think probably it's best to defer to the talk that we have coming up in the second half of our broadcast today by Ingrid Johanson. She talks about the tilt signals, and can share much more than I could here, right? I mean, we certainly had an intrusion that occurred that she'll discuss, right? And the intrusion was like a different kind of tilt signal that was much larger magnitude, that was abnormal, that signified injection of a big amount of magma into that reservoir deeper down. This is not exactly the same thing. This is a much smaller signal. It's shorter lived. It doesn't have nearly the amount of earthquakes that is associated with it. So it's kind of a whole different thing. But it's a small little detail that we notice that, USGS perhaps rightly, doesn't think it's even worth talking about. Okay, so.
Right. Marin extends that. Marin is one of our mods on Hawaii Tracker. Thank you, Marin, for all you do there. But she asks, the middle of the pause, could that come from anywhere else? That signal?
The middle of the pause, that
little bulge.
That's a good question. And once again, I'm gonna have to defer to Ingrid because she does mention how there are within a small area different signals that correspond to the shallow caldera, the shallow reservoir underneath Hale-Ma'u, and to the deeper reservoir more underneath Kanakako'i. And perhaps if we had something coming in at Kanakako'i, then you might see that signal. The size of it and the pattern leads me to believe it actually probably was. I mean, we think that deflation and inflation signals are something that come from the shallower chamber that's easier to detect, and it didn't seem like it was that different here or there, right? It just seemed more like it went through the cycle and almost like a hiccuped,
right?
Glitched one time, or however you think of it, right? Like this just didn't quite make it. Oh no, it wasn't quite done. I need to have I gotta get some more dense magma down, and okay, now here we go for real, right? And interesting that followed what beforehand was only a half-day pause, right? It was we haven't had a short pause in a while, but that one was, we had a short one and then a long one back to back. And so, maybe there's some relation there that was extra short, and that extra shortness led to something that caused it to hiccup.
Right. And also there's a general trend since the eruption started, it's sort of very vigorous and not many, no pauses. And then as it's progressed, we've introduced pauses, and then the pauses got more frequent. And now we get this pause that we think it's coming out of the pause based upon the tilt, and it just skips one or delays it more accurately. So yeah, it's wondering if these are going to become more common almost. These types of, we can't, when we're watching the tilt come up after a DI cycle and thinking, oh, okay, the pause is about to end. Well, maybe not, so you can miss them.
That did happen a couple times that I remember during a Pu'o days when we'd see, big deflation, inflation at the summit, and you think, okay, like maybe. And there would be a lag between the inflation at the summit and then the resumption of flows at Pu'o, first up at the cone and then later down by the pale and eventually down in the flow field. It would take, extra long for that to happen. Work its way through the entire system all the way down.
Right.
And there were times where we thought, okay, it's inflating now, the lava will come back. Then it would turn around and deflate again, and then Pu'o would never see any of the lava on the surface until maybe the next cycle. So that, and that's something we would watch because we'd lead people out to see the lava flows in Kalapana. So keep a close eye on, when there's more lava to be seen, obviously, and sometimes you hope and would not see it. I have to go back and try to find exact dates for that, but that did happen.
In a similar type situation where there's an eruption ongoing, but not a vigorous one, and it's kind of at that late stages of that, the phase of Pu'o.
Yeah, it was in the later phases. Yeah. And there can be a lot of small variations. And it can be that it leads to. It's everything is somewhat in equilibrium, but it's always the baseline is always moving, right? So it may change its pattern at some point, or it may continue just having longer and longer pauses, or it may have one long pause and then resume, or who knows? Just wait and see and try to make sense of it as it occurs, right? Since we really can't guess and be right most of the time. So,
All right. Well, I think that
yeah.
can do it for this round of questions. We'll hop into some volcano awareness videos if you want to take
Well,
those.
so I still have some
Oh,
little
you
bit
do?
more to talk about as far
Okay.
as earthquakes are going to cover. The earthquakes are one thing we want to make sure I share with you guys here. Earthquakes have quieted down. Let's show you guys the plot of the earthquakes here for the last month at the top of the screen. So you can see that compared to earlier in the month where we had that little flurry underneath the caldera deeper down below the reservoirs, that's died off. There's still a few events happening in that area right in there. You can see them. Better, bigger. There it is. And still South Flank events, fairly slow actually for the last week. And still Pahala events going on, and as usual, not a lot to talk about there. It's different from what's been going on for the last few years. Here's a last month showing that entire cluster. And really what I want to show you guys is this depth and time last month plot here. So in this view, you really can see it a little easier. On top, we're looking at these orange and yellow bands and a little bit of the green coming in below too, right? So this is the activity of earthquakes up within the structure of Kīlauea itself. And you can see that the base of it down here, this yellow to green zone, is where we had that big flurry of earthquakes that occurred earlier in the month. That's where the extra seismicity came from. But it also was followed by shallower stuff as well that was elevated. You can see that in the last week, we really lost that for the most part. It's still stuff happening, right, all the way down. It's still adjusting all the way up and down, but it's not as active as it was a couple weeks ago. That's really the earthquake story there. And while we're on it, let's not miss a GPS. GPS at the summit is showing similar patterns, maybe a slight inflationary uptick. And this is curious to note, we've seen variations of the size, so you really can't read anything into this signal. But if it were to keep going up more, you might think that earthquake swirl might have something to do with magma coming in. So we're kind of curious what happens here and if it relates to anything with those earthquakes that we saw a couple weeks ago. I think that's kind of on a horizon now. On the East Rift Zone, as just proof of this exact folly of trying to guess, without enough data here, we saw what looked like a little increased excursion, and then the most recent point is back down to the original trend. So it might be similar to these other scattered areas of data here, where you might have real adjustments going on the ground at the surface pool, right? But all these variations that occur, right? This is all for the last year. So all these variations over the last year have not put any lava out of the rift zone. We can see it's gone down, it's gone up, it's gone down a lot, it's gone up a reasonably amount, it's gone down faster, it's gone up faster, and all this is all too small in comparison to signals we need to see. So once again, we're still within that very small adjustment phase right there. Okay, so earthquakes, there was one last week that was notable, 4.7 offshore Maui. Deep earthquake, that's its location right here. Star, right, offshore. USGS issued an information statement. Depth of 25 miles, 41 kilometers below sea level. That puts it in that kind of flexure settling earthquake of the weight of the islands and the whole crust that it's riding on, adjusting to that changing dynamic. It's moving away from that hotspot, it's cooling down, it's getting eroded from the top, everything's adjusting and moving, and so you expect it to adjust as well, right? I think of it as lying in a mattress and then you're just rolling around, and so the mattress is almost like creaking one way or the other as the weight's shifting a little bit this way or that way. It's one way to consider. So, according to the scientist in charge from HVO, Ken Han, there was no impact on the active volcanoes. So, indicative of oceanic plate bending due to the weight of the islands. Common source in this area and not related to volcanic or impact on Maunaloa or Kīlauea. All right, here is the earthquakes map. There is that 4.7 last week offshore Maui up there. And then zooming into Hawaii Island, you can see that there are a couple around Kohala, one in Mauna Kea that's fairly deep down, one pretty shallow up at the surface up at Kohala area. One in southwest Kona, part of Maunaloa's west flank. This spot often has periodic smaller earthquakes in this range, so nothing to be alarmed about there. Here's our Kīlauea zone, up with the summit, south flank, Hala cluster. So all that's normal. And as far as Maunaloa, we have this band right in here of earthquakes. It's not a whole lot, but there's a few. They're still happening in the 2s, 1.5 range. Right, this is that south flank adjustment, the south flank of Maunaloa that creeps over in this direction. And then also, as Maunaloa summit inflates, we see earthquakes northwest and on a southwest rift upper area as well. So it's all normal. It shows still having magma coming into Maunaloa slowly, nothing drastic. You can compare earthquake rates in Kīlauea for the last year. Here's our most recent little spike that we had, right? This is the intrusion we had prior to the most recent eruption. So that, and I'm just going to flip it to Maunaloa. That's the reload, of course, where Maunaloa has been really quiet. A little bit more activity in the last, call it 3 months than 3 months prior to that, but nothing compared to what we had in the first 3 months of last year, right? Which was something that we hear Ingrid Johanson talk about as well. So she will give a more current Maunaloa update of what's been happening, and long story short, it's not a whole lot of change. There was that interesting event, but really not a whole lot of, really pretty flat, not a lot of change until September, and then really maybe a little bit more active since then at a slow rate, but nothing like this fast rate we saw about a year ago. More recently, almost flatlining over here on the right. A whole lot going on here. As far as the tilt, you see mostly this up and down of the day and night heating cycles. Summit, overall slow downward trend of the radial tilt, so nothing exciting there. And we'll pop in and look at the webcam of the sun setting up here at Maunaloa, right? Just catching just that east rim of the crater, a little bit of snow still up in there as the sun comes down. So that's all Maunaloa. We'll let Ingrid talk more about Maunaloa. There's one last thing to mention before we say some thank yous and switch over, and that's this week's Volcano Watch. Kīlauea, the volcano formerly known as Lo'ihi Seamount. So this is re-emphasizing the update in July of last year from the name Lo'ihi to Kīlauea by the Hawaii Board on Geographic Names. I will maybe excerpt a little bit here. The former name was introduced in 1955 by Dr. Kenneth O. Emery in consultation with Mary Kawena-Pukui and Martha Ho of Bishop Museum and Dr. Gordon MacDonald of HVO. So they selected names based on a short physical description, and for Lo'ihi, that feature means long, and indeed the seamount is longer than its neighbors. And so at the time, they interpreted Lo'ihi to be a cone erupted by Kīlauea. However, since then, it's been recognized to be its own separate volcano, and thus the name that was purely descriptive was thought to not be sufficient and did not carry enough of the cultural heritage of Hawaii. So, thus, there was a search through the chants, and several Malay chants were passed down before 54 and describe Kamaʻehua an undersea volcano, and as explained by the Edith Kanaka-Ole Foundation, Ule Kanahele, that name, Kamaʻehua, quote, is a powerful name that invokes the name of Telehonuamea and her birth out of Kanaloa, in parentheses, the ocean. And that was just adopted this last summer here. So that's the little bit of a history about it. And there's a little hidden add-on here for all you guys who want to know more about Tonga. Here's a little Tonga drop in here. The most recent violent explosive activity at Hunga Tonga Ha'apai volcano in the South Pacific has some residents wondering if Kamaʻehua has a potential for similar eruptions. And they say that I'll just keep reading the quote. We expect that as Hawaiian volcanoes near the surface and emerge, explosive interactions with ocean water may occur but Kīlauea is currently too deep underwater. Additionally, because Hawaiian volcanoes have more fluid magma than Hunga Tonga, Hunga Ha'apai, we expect smaller eruptions than January 14th, 2022, Hunga Tonga, Hunga Ha'apai catastrophic blast. It'll be millennia before Kīlauea emerges from Moananui Akea, Pacific Ocean. Volcano does occasionally make its presence known with earthquakes that are felt on the island of Hawaii. There was a host swarm 96, which was its most recent eruption, but also morning of 24th of 2021, there was a 4.9 there that was noted by everyone on the island there. So there we are. The reddish child of Kīlauea, Kamaehua Kīlauea, is the new name for Lo'ihi, and that'll be our third Hawaiian volcano covered today. And from there, we can pause and say our thank yous before we will play two talks by the USGS. They're both about 20 minutes long, and we will then recap and take questions and clarify anything that you guys have questions about from that point forward. So, Dane, what have we got for thank yous today? Oh, I can't hear you.
There we go. Microphone didn't want to unmute. All right, so want to thank everybody that tuned in today. We really do survive on viewers like you helping drive the algorithm, the comments, the likes, the subscriptions, all that really does help in the YouTube algorithm and the Facebook algorithm worlds. So we appreciate that. If you are so inclined to make monetary donations, we do take those on YouTube, but also on hawaiitracker.com, where we take donations. And I want to shout out some of the people that made some of those donations. We haven't done that for a little while. Want to recognize them for sure. Maureen S., Michelle B., Laura B., James P., Mel S., Elizabeth W., Jessica N., Robert G., Catrin G., Janet K., Mary M., Linda H., Mark D., Robert C., and Pat W. We appreciate all of you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, definitely. We also want to thank business that help support Hawaii Tracker and our work here, which is Kaleo's Bar and Grill. They have two locations, one in Pahoa, one in Orchid Land, and they have two different menus, completely different establishment. They have unique twists on some very traditional dishes, as well as some more local dishes. Their fish and chips is great. Burgers are good too. So definitely check them out. They have the indoor-outdoor dining. The Orchid Land location it's like semi-outdoor, so it's really nice. Definitely check out Kaleo's Bar and Grill. And I think that we can get into some questions that we didn't get in the little interim round of Q&A. One here about actually, we did just cover that one. About the explosive nature of the underwater Hawaiian volcanoes, and not just Lo'ihi, but all into the seamount history. There was a question about that.
Yeah, I think it's a combination for Tonga of that ideal or unideal depth just below the water, right? Like, not that far below the surface. The nature of the volcano being that more explosive kind of volcano in the first place, with that more silicic magma, right? And then the history of it as well. So there are several things that don't quite compare to Hawaii. We do have more explosive versions of ocean water interactions, like you might consider like some of the tough cones, like Molokini off Maui, or that kind of thing. But they're really small scale compared to, and really not exactly the same, kind of beast as what happened in Tonga. So really,
Right.
The short answer is we don't think so. Not from the kind of rocks that have been found and all that. But you never know. You might come around to something is discovered. The fact Kīlauea was recognized as being more explosive just within the last half a century, right? Before that, it was really There was no reason for people to believe that who had arrived after 1790 and before 1924. They were like, oh, this is how it is all the time. Right?
Right. There is a question here about Maunaloa, and we haven't gotten many questions about Maunaloa recently, just because Maunaloa is not doing a whole lot. But we hear about how we hear the terms thrown around in media sometimes about how Maunaloa is overdue or Maunaloa is building up towards something. So JW asks, is Maunaloa building a sulfur gas mass since 1984, or does the crust crossing the hotspot have less sulfur, or is it able to like vent type of thing?
So there is sulfur, but it's dissolved in a magma, right? So we do often see sulfur venting if the magma is close enough to be getting ready to about to erupt, kind of thing. So that's why we see so much of Kīlauea, because it's been at the surface in a lava lake or erupting or what have you. Before this most recent pair of eruptions, we did not see a lot of sulfur coming up, right? You know, we talked about where is all the sulfur going into the water pond? Where's the sulfur? What's going on? It was just the magma just wasn't shallow enough really yet, yeah. And that's considering that it wasn't shallow enough to put out gas, but it was shallow enough to erupt in short order afterwards. So the SO2 is, you know, really like a during an eruption kind of thing. So if the magma is in there, the sulfur is in there in the magma still. Right, and you know, and it depends on how it can get out of there, right? So it's not like built up like some critical mass that has to get out in some way. It's just in there with a magma, and if the magma's built up some critical mass to get out, that's a different thing entirely. But the whole issue with Maunaloa is that the south flank is moving, and so as a flank moves, it creates space in the reservoir within the mountain, and so it's more of not just is it filling and doing something, but it's more about at what rate is it filling and doing something? And what's that rate compared to the rate that it's opening and making space for itself? And sometimes it catches up and it's filling up faster than it can move out of the way, and sometimes it's not. And that's why you see these variations in these rates and trends and all that. And a lot of variable is there, right? But in all, there's nothing built up that has to get out, and it's not like overdue in a sense where if it doesn't burst, like, you know, it'll break the law of physics or something like that, right? It creates space by moving as well as erupting, and it has been accommodating a lot of magma, right? We heard about how the 2005 intrusion of magma into Maunaloa accommodated the same volume of magma as an 84 eruption, more or less, like the same amount of magma that actually erupted was what they calculated filled underground without erupting during just one of those GPS excursions, right?
Right.
So
right.
if you can find space for that much magma in there, then it can be coming in for decades and not need to erupt because it's not coming in fast enough compared to the rate of the side of it. The mountain's, you know, opening, and you know, there's a balance between the stuff getting further away and cooling down and becoming part of the south flank, and then allowing space for new stuff to new liquid to be in there as well. Right. Some balance of that kind of thing.
We have a $35 super chat from our longtime supporter Gary Bryan, who says, thanks Phil for this review, and also Dane for these awesome compilations. Great work. Appreciate it, Gary, as always.
Mahalo, Gary. Well, if there's no other questions about the activity, we should probably turn to the USGS updates. So we do have another 40 minutes to go here. It's going to make our update a little longer tonight.
Right.
So
yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, let me pull it up here for us, and we will see here. Show you guys the schedule, and you know, last week we were able to cover, and also in a long update, a lot of the earlier activity, the other updates. But since then, there have been 6 features put out, of which today, for time's sake, we're only going to do the updates. The one about deformation and then one about gas, and we'll do them in that order here. The first one by Dr. Ingrid Johanson, and we will let her begin here shortly.
Thank you for clicking on this Volcano Awareness Month talk. In this presentation, I'm going to summarize many of the deformation signals that we saw on Kīlauea and Maunaloa volcanoes over the past year. First of all, though, I want to introduce the basic concept of volcano deformation
Don't think
and
we're
why
getting
do
the video
volcanoes deform. The basic scenario starts with magma starting to move into a volcano, much like you can see in this cartoon, magma upwelling into the surrounding rock. This has the effect of pushing on this rock, moving it upwards. And these dots here represent all of our instruments, our GPS instruments, our tilt meters. Each of those then show motion in the case of GPS, or they show changing ground slope in the case of the tilt meters. You also start to stress out all the rock around the magma chamber, which creates a zone of earthquakes. Finally, when you reach a stress threshold, an eruption occurs, and at that point, magma moves out of the summit reservoir to feed the eruption, and you see the opposite signal, deflation of those same instruments. So this is the most straightforward scenario. Volcanoes like Kīlauea and Maunaloa are rarely so straightforward, but nonetheless, in general, inflation shows us that magma is moving into an area, and deflation shows us that magma is moving out of it. Two of the instruments that we use most frequently are GPS, which is shown on the left. In this case, we don't move around with the GPS. Instead, we fix the antenna very firmly into the ground so that we can measure very precisely how that single spot of the volcano is moving. And then on the right is the basic depiction of a tilt meter. And this long, thin instrument here is the tilt meter. This bubble level is inside that cylinder, and the cylinder goes down a borehole here. Fundamentally, inside this tilt meter is a bubble level, not unlike a level that you're used to using in your house, but extremely, extremely sensitive. This is a figure showing GPS velocity vectors from the past year spanning Maunaloa and Kīlauea. So you can see Maunaloa here on the left with Mokuaweoweo caldera up at the top. Here is Kīlauea's summit. This is an old DEM, so there's the old Halima'uma'u. And then the east drift is coming off to the east, out here towards the lower east drift zone. So this is essentially a summary of the deformation that we've seen over the past year, and I'll come back to various parts of this later. I also wanted to introduce interferometric synthetic aperture radar, or INSAR. This is a satellite-based method that gets an image of deformation spanning a wide area. One of the satellites that we use a lot is the European Space Agency's Sentinel-1 satellites, which I believe is what's in the picture there. For INSAR, we need 2 passes of the satellite. So we need it to fly over the ground once, and then fly over again on day 2. And we take the difference in the soundings from those 2 days in order to generate a map of what we call range change. So here, this animation on the right is showing at the top, this is what the deformation might be. So you might have subsidence and uplift. And then at the bottom is the corresponding INSAR image. And so you can see these rainbow patterns, these fringes. This is because the radar wave is an electromagnetic wave with a phase going from 0 to 360 degrees, or 0 to 2 pi radians. And so each of these fringes shows one cycle of this electromagnetic wave. And INSAR can produce images of Hawaii that look like this. So you can see we have coverage over the entire island instead of individual points like we do with GPS or tilt meters. This is an example of an INSAR image called an interferogram over Hawaii. This interferogram is from the Sentinel-1 satellite. It's a descending mode orbit, meaning the satellite's flying from north to south. It's looking in this direction towards the west. So the satellite is sending its energy off at an angle towards the west. The first acquisition day was November 14th, 2020, and the second acquisition day was November 21st of 2021, so spanning almost exactly a year. As I said before, these fringes show range change, and range change just means the change in distance between the ground and the satellite. And because the satellite looks at an angle and not straight down, that range change is affected by both horizontal and vertical motion. So what's important about this is that what it means is that sometimes these fringes have patterns that can be non-intuitive to interpret. So the center of the fringes might not necessarily be the center of uplift. And certainly it's not exactly correct to interpret the fringes as just uplift, which can be tempting because they look like topo contours. Another item to be aware of with the interferogram is that it's also sensitive to atmospheric water vapor. And as all of us here in Hawaii know, we have lots of atmospheric water vapor. So one of the reasons why I chose this interferogram was because it was particularly nice, very low atmospheric noise in this interferogram. However, there is still some. So in particular, this band here around Maunaloa, which is essentially the fog bank that comes, that surrounds that volcano very often. This is the atmospheric effect in the interferogram. There's also a mottled pattern here on the south flank, which is relatively small in this image, but can be a lot worse. This is also turbulent atmosphere that often happens here on the south flank. Likewise, some of these patterns here around Hualalai and on the Kona side and up here on Kahala coast are atmospheric in origin also. So typically, we look for a signal spanning several interferograms taken from different days before saying that any type of a subtle signal is deformation. However, some of the signals are so prominent, it's very clear that they're deformation and not likely atmosphere, as you can see with some of the fringes here along volcanoes. So coming back slightly to this idea of the center of the fringes not necessarily being the center of uplift, I want to zoom in here on Maunaloa, which is a very good example of this. So this is the motion of Maunaloa as seen by satellite radar over the past year. Looking at this, you might think that all of the deformation was happening here on the east side. However, if we also bring up GPS vectors from the same time period, we see a much more symmetric deformation pattern. So certainly there is more motion here on the east side, as is typical. This is part of the long-term flank motion on Maunaloa, but there is deformation on both sides of the volcano. What's happening here is that the horizontal motion away and the uplift, which pulls it towards the satellite, are canceling out to create essentially no range change in this area. So this is an example of how these two types of instruments really complement each other. So we can get sort of a ground truth 3D motion from GPS, whereas the INSAR gives us a full continuous picture of deformation rather than these individual points. So deformation at Maunaloa has been very modest. There's been very little motion above sort of our background, just a tiny bit of continued inflation. However, it still produced some interesting signals this past year. In particular, a very interesting tilt signal, and the tilt here is this middle box. This upper box is a histogram of seismicity, and this lower box is GPS line length, so change in distance across the caldera, essentially a change between two GPS stations. And this tilt signal may not look like much. It's only about 6 radians. But this was a truly unprecedented signal because never before have we seen a tilt signal at Maunaloa that we could clearly attribute to volcanic processes. So we see lots of motion on the tilt meters, but they're generally due to seasonal freeze and thaw, pressure changes, daily diurnal heating. We've not yet seen something, not until March, had we seen something that we could very clearly attribute to the volcano itself. And this might be surprising for people who are used to looking at Kīlauea, where we see tilt signals all the time, and they're very, very clear and precise. And it really comes down to the depth of the magma chambers. Kīlauea has a very shallow magma chamber that makes tilt changes show up very clearly. Maunaloa's is somewhat deeper, so it doesn't map into tilt quite so readily. So this was kind of exciting just for being unprecedented. However, after this sort of contraction event stopped, Maunaloa got very quiet. So whatever was going on, whatever it was trying to tell us with this event, it then went very quiet, and then that's how it's been since last March. So now let's move on to Kīlauea. And first I'll start out at the very end of the East Rift Zone, in the lower East Rift Zone. So first of all, I want to say what it is that I don't see in this pattern. And what I don't see is any indication of magma moving into or moving out of the East Rift in this region. This sort of mottled pattern, all of the hummocky stuff you can see through here, is consistent with cooling of these lava flows. So as they cool, they will subside quite a lot, which is what we're seeing here, especially in this area over Kapoho. We're seeing quite a lot of subsidence. So that's really the only signal that we see in interferogram in this region. And that can be corroborated here with the GPS. So these vectors are all very small, and out of the tip is sort of the smallest. So there's really no indication here of any magma accumulation or magma, moving out of the rift in the lower East Rift Zone. Moving up slightly here to the area around Pu'uo'o. The first thing to notice here is that the rainbow pattern of these fringes, blue, pink, yellow, is the opposite of the rainbow pattern at Maunaloa, and as you'll see later, the rainbow pattern at Kīlauea's summit. This is indicating that this is an area of subsidence rather than uplift. This subsidence only started in December 2020, so about the time that the first summit eruption, sort of post 2018, started. We saw a change from uplift to subsidence. Here's the GPS vector map. It's a little confused. All these vectors are plotting on top of each other, so it's a little hard to see what's going on. Pu'uo'o is about here. But we can look at the time series here of one of these vectors. This is NPOC, which is just to the north of Pu'uo'o. And this time series here of uplift, so this is only the up component of the GPS station, starts right at the end of the 2018 eruption and goes until the end of 2021. So you can see for most of this time period, we saw fairly steady uplift as the rift began to be refilled. But starting just towards the end of 2020, that switched to a very modest deflation, which is what we're seeing now. Moving even slightly more uprift, there's a very curious pattern in between Pu'uo'o and the summit. I won't talk too much about this. However, this signal we attribute to creep, fault creep in the eastern Kauai. Fault creep is a phenomenon where a fault will just slide steadily past itself rather than building up strain and generating an earthquake. So the fault here is just happily slipping slowly every day. This is a signal that we saw prior to 2018, so it's not a new phenomenon. But it is interesting that it continues and that it was quite prominent this past year. It was very, very clearly stuck out in this one-year interferogram. Now, finally, we can come up to Kīlauea's summit. We zoom in here, you can see most of the fringes that we see in this one-year interferogram are located here just south of the caldera region. So here's the caldera outline. Here's the outline. This is the portion we call the downdrop block. And then this is now the deeper Halemaʻumaʻu crater. So most of the deformation in this one-year snapshot is due to an intrusion that occurred in August of 2021 here in the South Caldera region. If you look very closely, you can see some fringes here just circling that downdrop block. That is the deformation pattern associated with deflation during the two eruptions that were spanned by this interferogram. So you can see that compared to this intrusion, those are relatively modest, and it's a very compact spatial extent that is really affected by the eruption deflation. Looking here at the GPS, we see sort of the same thing. So we've got this nice radial pattern. If we kind of look for a midpoint here of this radial pattern, we're actually locating somewhere south of the caldera. So the GPS also, when we look at it in a full year snapshot, it's really being dominated by this South Caldera intrusion. And we can break that down a little bit by station. So first we can look at this station Calm. So Calm is located on that downdrop block. It's as close as possible to the shallow Halemaʻumaʻu reservoir, sort of as close to being on top of that as we could get it. And so you can see here a very steady increase indicating inflation of that shallow Halemaʻumaʻu reservoir up until September of this year, when this second summit eruption started, and we saw rapid deflation as that eruption got started. You can contrast that with this Cone Peak station, which is not that far away from Calm. However, Cone Peak is outside of the caldera and out in the South Caldera region. In this case, there was very little motion at Cone Peak. I should say that each of these time series is showing the up-down motion, so vertical motion at each of these sites. So this is uplift and then subsidence. So not much happening here, a little bit of uplift. And then here in August, as this intrusion came through, we saw lots of uplift at Cone Peak. And then slow subsidence. And Cone Peak was far enough away that you don't really see much deformation at all associated with the eruption. And C-Rim, the Caldera Rim Station, which is located just here, that is kind of splits the difference. So you can see here there is some uplift, a little bit of uplift associated with that South Caldera intrusion, and then a little bit of subsidence associated with that eruption. So kind of straddles both worlds. However, none of these stations are that far away from each other. And it gives you a sense for just how spatially heterogeneous the deformation patterns can be. You go from one site to another, it doesn't look like they should be behaving all that differently, but they're showing very different patterns through time. So that is it for this year's summary. Just to summarize some of the takeaways, I just wanted to present lots of deformation, a lot of the interesting deformation throughout Kīlauea and Maunaloa. So it's not just at eruption sites, but we see deformation throughout these volcanoes all the time. They're very active in that way. Wanted to emphasize that there's no clear deformation due to magma accumulation in the shallow East Rift Zone, either in the lower or the middle East Rift Zones. Deflation following the eruptions at Kīlauea summit was localized and relatively modest. And then finally, by far, the biggest signal that we saw this year was from this intrusion into the South Caldera region in August. Part of the reason for that is what we're measuring with deformation is storage. If the magma is trapped and creating pressure in the magma chamber, that's when we see deformation. So in a sense, that intrusion where nothing was erupted, really just pressurized that region and produced this nice big deformation signal. So of course, this was a talk all about deformation, and at this point, you may have seen the other Volcano Awareness Month talks on different data types and different disciplines. And I want to emphasize that we take all of these data together. We never look at one data type in isolation. So in order to gain a complete picture of all the phenomenon that I've talked about today, we really look at all of these data together and bring together the perspectives of all the different scientists at the observatory. All right, thank you.
All right, Dane, what'd you think?
Yeah, there's a few interesting things in that one. First one that jumped out at me was the note on the tilt meters on Maunaloa, that the March signal was the first real signal from Maunaloa that they could confirm that's originated from the volcano magmatically. And we've talked about like how we don't really use the tilt meters up there, and we explained before, like, don't worry about that one, right? So it's just interesting to see, like, oh no, all of them were false positives, or just something else, diurnal cycle, snow, what have you.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. The other thing that jumped out at me was that interferogram clean. Like, normally when we process these things or get them processed, they are not easy on the eyes. The fading that they did were areas to just reduce the noise where there was nothing really happening. I really like that. It's like, more of those, please.
Yeah, and great how she explained the weather effects, and how some of the even in the clean one per se, right, that actually has some of the fog bank around Maunaloa, right, in the saddle, and Kohala, and turbulence over Kalapana.
Yeah, I mean, Monologue, just what she said there really shows that old saying, first rule of tilt meters is don't trust tilt meters, or whatever it was, at least up there type of thing. You have to know the specific instances, like that March one, where you can attribute it.
Right.
The other one was the jumping down to the lower East Rift Zone and some of the stuff going on there. It was amazing just how precisely that zoomed in interferogram of Lower Puna matched the profile of the lava flow. I mean, you could trace it basically and be pretty accurate just off of that. So that was interesting. I was also surprised to see, I'd have to look at it a little bit more closely, but the movement of the lava delta that has been established, right? It kind of was wondering how much that had moved compared to the rest of it, and it didn't really jump out at me, right? It looked pretty consistent. I'm sure you might be able to dig out some more detail on that.
Yeah, it's hard to tell just from the interferogram, right? Because you have to incorporate the look direction and the offset and all of that, right? But there's like a larger patch of colors on the delta area where it was the bay before, but I mean, it's hard to tell. It looks like there's subsidence everywhere, right? And I would probably guess you take the lava thickness map, and probably based on that, you could probably get a pretty good estimate of where it's the thickest is subsiding the most, because it got the most stack to compress.
Right. And then I wanted to get your thoughts on the fault creep that she was discussing on the Kīlauea fault, and how that might play. How that might play into the south flank.
Yeah, it's totally a south flank edge signal there, right? I can zoom it in here, right? It's hard to tell really from the map, but there is Makaupui crater. Manaulu is right there. That's Pauahi and Kīlauea craters right up there. Right? So this is a bend in the rift zone right here. We're looking at this area essentially right around the bend, right around Maunaloa area. It seems to be right the eastern extent of the Kauai fault zone, creeping along. Right. So this is interesting because this is an area that we've talked about, this upper east rift zone being almost like a part of the magma chamber at the summit, the magma reservoir. It's also all connected. It's connected all the way up to the bend, and now we're seeing essentially the bend is moving, creeping, so that there's more room going, in there as well, right? Mm-hmm. So in theory, it's kind of connecting all the way to Pu'o'o even better than it was before. And we knew it was connected to Pu'o'o because we saw the effect of inflation at Pu'o'o, right? And I noted there was almost half a meter of uplift at Pu'o'o since 2018, right? That's a good amount, right? What is that, like 20 inches ish, right? Something like that, 1.5 feet at Pu'o'o. And then since then, it's lost a lot of it as well. It's been deflating since then, showing that two things: one, that it was well connected, and two, that even if it's better connected now, it's not actually, the magma is still going away, and the whole area is actually deflating still, and it's the net loss towards the summit, you'd think, right? So that's interesting as well to note that.
One of the things, just looking at that, it was not really the focus of this talk, but the GPS stations around Pu'o'o and that direction that they were taking
this past year,
slightly more to the west
pattern
or to the east than most of the other signals that were going more to the south.
Mm-hmm.
And just looking at that, and my immediate question was, okay, so what's it doing north of the North Pu'o'o station, the NPOC? What is it doing just north of that? Is it moving in a similar direction, or did we see that split like we see maybe a little bit further up the rift zone in those stations?
Right. Yeah, I think it's usually you have to have some kind of frame of reference, right? So you have to consider something being fixed. So a lot of times it's Mauna Kea or something off to the north, and then depending, then this area may not move a whole lot relative to Mauna Kea, and sometimes you have like very little signal at all, or if you do have arrows, or you're not necessarily consistent. So they may even be counting part of that area as the actual reference point as a fix. I'm not quite sure there.
Oh, okay.
But I'd probably guess Mauna Kea if this is zoomed in on an earlier map that was island wide.
Right.
That would be my guess.
Makes sense. Well, I think I don't see any questions about this video, so we can go ahead and get into the next one. On that note.
Well, a couple of last things. I thought the offset of the INSAR is really cool. I think when you look at the look direction and how if you imagine looking through the mountain, right, it's natural you'd see it pop up like on the side that you're looking at, right? Especially if you consider the magma chamber is a little bit deeper and not right at the surface. So, the intersection of the satellite looking in that direction and the depth of the mountain certainly projects on that flank. So that's pretty interesting to consider. And that's going to be something that happens every time on every single descending pass of the satellite, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty cool. And then we've learned a whole bunch about INSAR, so it's really cool.
Yeah, definitely. Good talk, that one.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, very localized. One of the last thing I know that I mentioned before, how localized the summit signals are, right? Like on a down drop block, different from on a crater rim, different from just to the west on a caldera by the southwest rift. Right? How the signals get mixed together. So very localized, as I mentioned before. So yeah, maybe let's move to the gas talk as our last one here. And I know this is going on for a while still. We'll keep it under 2 hours here, but we better get started on this next one by Patricia Nadeau. So here she is, without further ado.
Hi everyone, and thanks for logging on for this next installation of Volcano Awareness Month talks. My name is Tricia Nadeau. I'm a research geologist and I head the gas geochemistry group at HVO, which is why I'm here today to talk to you about what was going on with gas emissions in 2021 at Kīlauea. So I am going to cheat a little bit and start back in 2020 because that's when we had the first lava, the first eruption show up since the big 2018 events. So this video is just showing what was going on the left at Kīlauea Summit on December 20th of 2020. So with all this new lava came a lot of gas. So if you look at the right, there's a plot of SO2 emission rate for just that little bit of December in 2020. I'm going to focus mostly on SO2 for this talk, sulfur dioxide. It's not the most abundant volcanic gas, that would be water and carbon dioxide, but sulfur dioxide is easier to measure than the other two, and it affects people downwind in terms of health issues and VOG the most. So we focus mostly on SO2. So you can see here in December, we started off very high with over 50,000 tons a day of sulfur dioxide, but it dropped quickly over the next few days. And then after a few days, we sort of leveled off here around 5,000 to 10,000 tons a day. Now, as that eruption progressed, things decreased even more. So January 1st is somewhere around here. So to the left is what I already showed you on the previous graph. And you can see that it was over 5,000 here, and now we're getting closer to 0. But looking at this graph here, it's not the easiest way to view this data. So I'm going to do a little bit of a change of scale on our next slide. So here's that same graph, and each one of these lines on the left side here is 10,000 tons per day. But I'm going to switch to what's called a logarithmic scale. So instead of every line being 10,000 tons a day, on the right here, every line is 10 times the previous line. So we jump from 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 and then up to 100,000. So what that does is let us keep all the data on one plot, but you can see the details on the low end. So over here, between April and May of 2021, this all just looks like a flat line on the left plot. But with our log scale, you can see that during that time period, there was actually a continuous decrease in the SO2 that was being erupted. So all of my plots from now on are going to be in this log scale. So remember, it's still very high. It's just a different number jump for these higher lines over here, and we can see the detail at the low end. So what's really interesting is that during this sort of middle period here, where things sort of leveled off at about 1,000 tons of SO2 per day in February into early March, what we saw was, now these are common events at Kīlauea, even before this eruption. Tilt is in this blue line, and that is showing when tilt goes down, Kīlauea Summit is deflating, and then when it goes back up, it's inflating a little bit. Now what's interesting is that you can see in these sort of orangey brown circles, that's our SO2 emission rate. So when Kīlauea was deflating, the SO2 was low, and then when it started inflating, the SO2 would go up again. So the SO2 sort of mimicked this deflation. And that's because the lava was also mimicking the inflation and deflation. The lava lake level would go up and down in the same way. And the gas is very linked to how much lava is coming out. So that's why we were able to see these sort of 3 different data sets linked really closely as Kīlauea was inflating and deflating, which was pretty interesting. Now, our eruption sort of died off at the very end of May in 2021. And then we had another period with no eruption, no lava. So what that looked like in terms of the SO2 emission rate was very low emissions. So you can see here on our plot, here's 100. We had a couple days that were about 110 tons per day, but for the most part, SO2 emission rates when there was no lava over the summer was between about 50 and 100 tons per day. Now let's put that in context with previous eruptions. Here's our same plot again, and this blue line is 5,000 tons a day. So that is what was emitted by the lava lake that we had at the summit from 2008 to 2018. That lava lake was a relatively steady emitter, and it averaged about 5,000 tons. So you can see, yes, this December 20 eruption was around there for a while, but pretty quickly it ended up below that. So this eruption was not consistently putting out as much gas as the previous lava lake. Now 250, that's what the summit sort of averaged even before that 2008 lava lake. So when there was no lava at the surface before 2008, the summit still emitted about 250 tons a day on average of SO2. So we sort of pretty quickly crossed through that and ended up actually lower, closer to 50 tons a day or less, which is what we had between the 2018 activity and the 2020 eruption, part of which we had a water lake for. So emissions were very low during that water lake era, usually lower than 50 tons a day. In this interruptive period over the summer of 2021, we didn't really often get quite that low, about down to 50 tons a day, but somewhere between that 50 and 100. So it was pretty close to that period between 2018 and 2020. Now, of course, we had another summit eruption show up at the very end of December of 2021. So here are just some pictures from really the first few minutes of that eruption. We happened to have some of our geologists out in the field doing field work south of Kīlauea summit. And so when they looked up, they could see this new gas plume rising. And this is just a closer view as they got closer to the eruption site. So these are photos from the very beginning of that eruption of all the gas coming out early in the eruption sequence. So if we throw that on our same plot again, you can see that just like the December 2020 eruption, the September eruption started very high, even slightly higher, although we measured earlier in the eruption because the 2020 eruption started at night and we couldn't make our SO2 measurements if there's no sunlight. So because the September eruption started in the afternoon, we got an emission rate right away. It was about 90,000 tons a day. But just like the December eruption, it dropped off very quickly over the next few days to a week, back down to, again, we sort of crossed through this 5,000 tons a day from the older lava lake era. Now what I want to do is look at the two eruptions a little more closely, but on the same sort of plot, not in sequence, but let's overlay the eruptions. So the December 2020 eruption is in blue, and the September 2020 eruption is in red. And you can see for the first, so this is 30 days since the eruption started. This plot goes about to not quite 40 days, maybe 37 days or so. So a month and a week. If these were all the same color, you wouldn't be able to tell these two eruptions apart. The gas emissions for both eruptions behaved very, very similar. High at the beginning, a quick decline, and then sort of a slower decline over the next month or so. And then we had this sort of lower plateau where things bounced around between about 2,000 and 6,000 tons a day. So like I said, that was the first 4 to 5 weeks of both of these eruptions. Things started to change after about a month in 2021, 4 to 6 weeks. So here's that section where things looked very similar. And then suddenly we had this very low SO2 emission rate for the 2021 eruption. We weren't sure what was going on, but obviously we just kept collecting data as time went by. And you can see, whereas the December eruption sort of stayed in this very narrow band of SO2 emission rates, just around or below 1,000 tons a day, this most recent eruption in 2021 was all over the place, bouncing up and down between, these are about 5,000 to 6,000 tons a day on the high end, and these low ones are only about 120 tons per day. So this is very different between the two eruptions. One was pretty steady, and this new one is having these wild swings from day to day. Now what's happening there is that this new eruption has these lava pauses or lulls in activity where the lake almost cools completely over. There's only a little bit of lava at the surface. So that's what we're looking at in this video here on the left. You can see everything crusted over right there. It's very cold, not much lava, and then it surges back. And so it's been doing this for the past month, every few days or so, this cycle of cooling, and then the lava surges back. And with that lava surge, that's where our high gas emission rates come. When the lava's cooled over, that's where we get the low emission rates, about just over 100 tons per day. And what's happening is it's linked to that inflation and deflation again. So the same as the previous eruption with the lava and the gas and the tilt, that's the blue line on this plot, they're linked. It's just this eruption is much more drastic. When we have these decreases in tilt, the lava completely slows down and cools over, and we have 100 tons a day of SO2. Then it surges back and we have thousands of tons of SO2 per day with all that lava coming out. So it's similar to the previous eruption, but just on a bigger scale, bigger variations this time around. So what do those variations mean for VOG, for those of us living here on Hawaii Island? Well, any SO2 coming out means a potential for VOGgy conditions. So if we had a constant emission rate, say it was always 2,000 tons a day, whether you get exposed to VOG or not depends mostly on whether the wind blows that plume in your direction. But now with a variable emission rate, there's another factor in there. Maybe the wind is blowing the plume in your direction, but if you're lucky, it'll be when Kīlauea is paused and the emissions are only about 100 tons a day. And then the VOG won't be so bad. So you can always check out the VOG forecast and other information about VOG on the VMAP website or the VOG dashboard from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And actually with this September 2021 eruption, they put out a new format for this VOG model website. So check that out and you can see what it looks like now. You can look for SO2 or sulfate aerosols, which is what sulfur dioxide eventually converts to in the atmosphere. And so I mentioned these differences between the 2020 and 2020 eruptions in terms of those wild swings in emission rate, but there's also a big similarity. So in addition to how much gas is coming out, just that emission rate, HVO also measures gas chemistry. We can do that with drones, with stations on the ground, or with these portable infrared spectrometers, which are what you see in the picture here. So we're measuring the chemistry of this gas that's coming out. So not just the SO2, but SO2, carbon dioxide, water, and other species like hydrogen chloride, things like that. So one of the main things that we look for in that chemistry is how much carbon dioxide is coming out. If there's more carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, it means that the magma is coming from deeper within the earth. It's newer, it's fresher, it's coming from down in the mantle, pretty deep. Whereas if there's low carbon dioxide, it means that yes, it's new magma that's just reaching the surface as lava, but it's magma that sat around within Kīlauea's magma chamber for a while first. And as it sat there, some of that carbon dioxide leaked out over time. So when it finally erupts, a lot of the CO2 is already gone. So the erupting gas is less rich in carbon. So what we were seeing in our data from both the 2020 eruption and the 2021 eruption is that they are low in carbon dioxide. So what this means is that for both eruptions, the magma that comes out as lava was actually sitting around for a while already. This is not brand new magma from in the mantle. So that's one thing that we've learned from the gas chemistry is that these eruptions, even though they're behaving a little bit differently on the surface, where that magma came from that sourced both of them is from a pretty similar place. It stayed in Kīlauea for a while before erupting. Now, the last thing I'll cover, because I'm sure people have questions about it, is what about the East Rift Zone? You know, I've been talking a lot about all this going on at the summit, but we do have previous eruptive sites in Pu'uo'o and the lower East Rift Zone from 2018. For Pu'uo'o emissions, we have 2 permanent continuous gas monitoring sites around Pu'uo'o, which detect whether there's SO2 coming from there or not. And you can see on this top graph, we did have SO2, you know, before that 2018 activity. During the 2018 activity, we were measuring SO2 on those East Rift Zone sites. But since then, this is flatline. These spikes here are just when some of our HVO staff were there doing calibrations or maintenance on the site. But we're essentially down at 0. There's not SO2 that's detectable coming from Pu'uo'o. And for the lower East Rift Zone, we do periodic checks with portable instruments. So this is one of our summer student workers holding, this is the gas sensor on her back, and there's a tube that she can suck in the gas with when she puts it closer to degassing site. So we check those periodically at the eruptive sites and other places nearby that were affected by some of the ground heating. And we never detect SO2 there either. So SO2 would be a marker of potential activity, and we don't see it at Pu'uo'o anymore, and we don't see it in the lower East Rift Zone anymore. I know that some people who live in subdivisions near the East Rift Zone sometimes can smell a little bit of a sulfury smell. Generally, that's going to be probably H2S. So sulfur, that's hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is the rotten egg smelling sulfur, whereas SO2 it's sharper, more like when you strike a match or set off fireworks. So both of those sites, the Lower East Rift Zone and Pu'u'o, do still produce minor amounts of that hydrogen sulfide, the H2S. And under certain wind and weather conditions, you may get a little bit of that drifting into nearby population centers and subdivisions. So if you smell a little bit of that, it's actually because human noses are even more sensitive to that hydrogen sulfide than we are to SO2. So even though there's just a tiny, tiny amount of H2S coming out of places like Pu'u'o, if it blows your way, you might smell it. But it doesn't mean that anything is necessarily going on with an eruption because, like I said, we're not seeing any SO2, and it's SO2 that's related to eruptions. So I'll wrap up there with this nice video of all that gas coming out when the September 2021 eruption started. So as I said, some things were the same as the 2020 eruption. We had a new eruption each year. The magma and the gas were previously stored within Kīlauea because of that low carbon. And throughout the whole sequence, throughout all of 2021, we're not seeing any SO2 on the East Rift Zone. And we do have some new interesting phenomenon with this 2021 eruption, these bigger swings in the SO2 and these lava pauses. So that's been going on for the past month, and we'll just have to wait and see what goes on with the eruption and the degassing as we head into 2022. So thanks everyone for listening. I hope you learned something, and mahalo.
All right. Mahalo, Trisha and Ado. I did learn something. What do you think, Dane?
Yeah, a few things in there that were pretty good. It is interesting to find out that they, we knew they were doing the geochemical analysis, but we only got really that first batch and then only, little tidbits from there. But to find out like it's still mostly stuff that's been circulating in the system for a while instead of fresh from the depths is interesting to know. Right.
And that's probably a point that's worth repeating is that when she says deep, she said deep from the mantle, right? So like,
right.
That means that everything, that mantle boundary is down like 10K down or more, 10, 15K. Like that's the depth of those earthquakes that we saw last week week before. So that's where that gets interesting is like, connection between that and would you, if that was coming up, you might expect more CO2 if it's coming from below there. But if it's anything above that, even if it's a South Caldera chamber, even if it's something from, call it 8K down below there that intrudes upwards, any of that stuff will already have had some loss of CO2, right? That's the interesting part. So deep and shallow are always relative, and it's worth reminding what we mean by deep in this case.
Right, and deep varies depending on what we're talking about, but in this instance, yeah, definitely. It also brings up the question then, like, okay, if it isn't strictly being supplied from depth, where is the magma supply going that is coming up from the depth?
Well, it is coming from depth. It's not coming from depth fast enough to not degas before it reaches the surface, right? So it's coming from depth slowly enough that the gas is coming out. So let's say that it crosses that threshold at 10, 15K down, whatever happens to be exactly. And it starts to lose its CO2 from that point on, right? So that anything further up is already gonna have that effect, right? So it's basically not coming from 10 to 15K depth all the way up in one go is what we're learning.
Right.
And if it were doing that, that might be something that we might be more worried about it actually causing explosions like that whole 1790 era of the volcano, right? When some of that Kanakakoi tephra from AGU we learned, we thought the magma was generated down in mantle depths, and that's what came up fast all the way up to actually cause those big explosions, perhaps. So that's why it matters, and that's the main difference here, right?
It was interesting to see the overlay between the gas measurements and the tilt. So you see those DI cycles, which also correspond to the pauses, which also correspond to the gas output. But the question I immediately had is like, all right, so that's the latest little thing that was recorded that took place after the recording. This missing DI cycle almost, or this hiccup one.
With that lava surge,
talked about
that's where our high gas is
What did the gas do there? Did the gas pick up and trace the line, or did the gas provide an indicator of any kind that this wasn't, the magma returning to the surface? Is there any anomaly in that?
Yeah, that would be really cool to see. Yeah, they see their continuous monitors, what they might show in that, and for that little window. Yeah, because the once every few days data points aren't giving us a resolution.
Right.
Yeah, good
right.
question. It'd be cool to see that. Yeah, and speaking.
Yeah, just to see if that's, because I don't really know what if it traced or not, so that'd be interesting.
Yeah, that would be a cool detail, and yeah, yes, I mean it could go either way, really, right? I mean, and
yeah,
it would be cool to know for sure. And yeah, interesting how it pauses, affecting the gas output differently this time than in the 2020 eruption as well.
Right, which goes along with those pauses too. It's interesting, that whole thing. There was one thing I forgot to mention about the previous video on Maunaloa that I do want to bring up. After the March event, that contraction that we were talking about as well at the time, we started talking about like, hey, Maunaloa is really quiet, right? It is incredibly quiet. And then we got to that point in the speech, and she described Maunaloa as being, very quiet. So it comes back to my question of why is it at advisory? Why not? What is background if this is not background? Like, why are we not at green normal for Maunaloa at this point in time?
Yeah, that'd be a question.
I was waiting for it, and then she literally gets to that part, and she's like, "Yeah," and then it's really quiet. I'm like, "Okay, so why? Why are we having advisory for this thing right now?"
Yeah, good question. Might be some policy, something that where if we actually had a in-person seminar, we could actually ask that, right? But that's the one. I really love the online format. I love that they're still doing it despite all the pandemic challenges, right? But you don't get to ask the follow-up questions you would.
Right.
Any other tool. Yes, maybe one last thing. It's worth mentioning. We've been looking at the reports about how they talk about pool SO2 has gone down, and they always, even today they still mention that measurement from last year in January as their SO2 measurement for pool oil, which has always kind of irked me a little bit. But I'm, obviously it's just not updated in text because there's continuous monitors down there, and that's where they're really looking at, right? So that's something that should be monitored. Should just say the most recent SO2 monitors are not showing that, right? Rather than refer to something from last year, because they have more recent data plotted on this graph, right? Than January 2021. So and then obviously that's Middle East rift and still Lower East rift, same story as we've had for a while. So just reinforce that. All right, we can still make it under 2 hours if we cut it off.
We did it. All right, everybody. Appreciate everybody that stuck out for this whole 2-hour episode. We will be back next week with a more normal episode. Then we'll try and finish out the week after that, all the Volcano Awareness Month stuff.
Yeah, bring guys the other videos for sure. Yeah, in the future.
All right. Well, that'll do it for us. Until next time.
Yeah, mahalo Dane for HawaiiTracker.com. He's Dane DuPont. I'm Philip Ong. Mahalo, everyone. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next week.